SIFTER.com.au.
G'day and welcome to Drop Rate by SIFTER. Drop Rate is SIFTER's review podcast packed with thoughts and feelings about the newest video games, giving you insights from some of the best games writers around. My name is Chris Button, and joining me on the panel this week is Christy McWalter, one of the fabulous contributors over at Games Hub, plus James Wood, assistant editor at Well Played. This week we're talking about Stray Gods, the role-playing musical, one of the most anticipated games from an Australian indie studio in recent history. The debut title from Summerfall Studios combines talents of some of the world's most notable RPG writers and musical talents. It's also a bold experiment that could inspire a future generation of games. But before we discuss Stray Gods, here are the top stories featured on Walkthrough, SIFTER's weekly news podcast.
Hi, I'm Kyle Paletto.
And I'm Fiona Bartholomeus.
And here are the top stories this week on Walkthrough, SIFTER's weekly news podcast for Sunday, 12th of November.
Sony Pictures and Nintendo team up for a live-action film adaptation of The Legend of Zelda.
Valve announces the spec-bumped new Steam Deck OLED, tweaking and improving everything.
Australian indie CRPG Broken Roads is delayed to 2024, a week before it was due to launch.
And the Overwatch League is officially done, with Blizzard and teams announcing the end.
You can get every episode of Walkthrough for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or on our website sifter.com.au every Sunday.
You're listening to Drop Rate by SIFTER. Visit us on sifter.com.au.
Like a boat lost at sea, with no sails, not a breeze.
So talking Stray Gods, at a fundamental level, Christy, the core concept of Stray Gods is right there in the subtitle. It's a role-playing musical. But can you tell listeners and viewers what the game is about generally and how the gameplay works?
Yeah, so it's a work of interactive fiction. So I guess kind of like a visual novel, but a bit more there's a bit more movement on screen than that. So kind of think like Telltale style of games, and it's in like a film noir comic kind of style. And it follows Grace, who's like a 20-something who's recently left college, and she's feeling kind of lost about what to do with her life. And through a series of events, she finds herself taking on godhood from someone that she meets. So she becomes a god, like quite quickly and unexpectedly. And yeah, that doesn't really go down well with the council of the gods, that like they're called the idols. Yeah, that doesn't really go down well with them. So Athena, the leader of the idols, sentences her to death. But luckily Apollo kind of sways the chorus, which is the council, to give her 7 days to prove her innocence. And that's what makes up the gameplay. So you play through each of the 7 days, and you're undertaking an investigation and you're trying to prove Grace's innocence. Yeah, and I guess the musical part of the title comes in that between the dialogue scenes, there's these scenes of music that you're using Grace's powers as a god, which, because she's a muse, she's taken on Calliope's powers. So yeah, you're using that to investigate and like draw information out of people, because it's kind of, yeah, her magical power, I guess.
Yeah, I'm really curious because in terms of the musical concept and taking a lot of inspiration from musical theatre, is there an in-game justification or in-game reason given that it plays out like a musical, or is it just it's a musical, let's run with it?
There are like a few moments where Grace will reference and be like, is it weird that I'm singing this? But basically the in-game justification is that it's kind of like a siren song. Like she can use music to persuade people to say things that they wouldn't say otherwise. Like it's getting their true feelings out of them. And she needs to do that because the gods are like deceptive, basically. So she needs to find ways to get them to tell her the information that she needs so that she can prove her innocence and live. So yeah, that's really the only justification, I guess. And then beyond that, it's just like it's a musical because it's fun.
Of course. And as we know, we've seen a lot of, I suppose, marketing and PR in the lead up to Stray Gods release. There's a lot of talent involved at every stage of development, from behind the scenes to writing, to the development, to the vocal talent and the musical talent as well. So James, how well ultimately do you think Stray Gods achieves its vision of being an RPG and a musical, or as it's there in the subtitle, a role-playing musical?
Yeah, look, I think that the way this is probably going to work out is it's the same with music, right? It's one of the most subjective sort of like art forms that we have. And so the way something hits somebody's ear or somebody's soul, it's going to be very different from person to person. I think I struggled with the game a bit more than I would have liked to. I think that there is a bit of a dissonance sometimes between the role-playing mechanics and the musical component of the experience. And it's because I sort of look to a musical track for not necessarily cohesion, but like a rhythm and a vibe that I can continuously invest myself in. And I think that it gets this sort of emotional, vibe of the world correct. But sometimes when a song would be playing out, the option that I would like to choose would interrupt the flow of the song and fundamentally change something like the tempo or the overall rhythm of the experience. And so for me, it ended up with like this strange dissonance between I know how I would like this to play out if I was watching a musical, and I know how I would like my Grace to handle the situation. And when those two things didn't align, which was fairly often for me, it ended up in sort of a strange, slightly uncomfortable kind of like pacing problem for me, because I did often find myself just wanting to let it play out, because I do think that the overall kind of like tone of this world is really interesting and fascinating, and the game gets so much right about everything it's built sort of around the central mechanic. But for me, I had a bit of a fundamental disconnect at times from it. Because I do think the writing of Grace, like I love Grace as a protagonist. I think she has so much heart and so much like raw energy to her. And I think that kind of lost 20-something vibe is something that I think anybody who's going to play this could very easily identify with. But like I said, sort of the way that those choices then impact the flow of the actual feeling of the game is where the problem comes in. Everything that Grace could say in those situations feels distinctly Grace to me. I never sort of doubted those options. But it did occasionally feel like, the angry option would be my correct Grace sort of choice, but it was a slow, beautiful song, and it would be strange to cause a spike all of a sudden that I felt like the song then needed to revert back to its original kind of cadence. And so, yeah, I feel like it was in the mechanic there.
I'd like to take a little bit of a step back, and Christy, could you explain to listeners and viewers how the choices work and how sort of the mechanics of how like a song in Stray Gods works?
Yeah, so it's kind of like the whole game works on, like cutscenes with a dialogue wheel at the bottom. And there'll be like, 3 or 4 options in different directions. So depending on whether you're playing on PC, I was playing on PS5, so you just kind of like flick the stick in the direction of the option that you want to select. And then it's the same thing in the songs, but the options are split into 3 colors, which is for the 3 traits that you can choose for Grace at the start of the game. So that's clever, charming, or kick-ass. And normally within dialogue, depending on what trait you've chosen, it will kind of influence like what options you can pick. Whereas when you're in a song, you can pick any of the 3 options. So that's kind of what James is talking about there. It can influence the sound of the song if you've been picking like a bunch of charming options and then you pick the kick-ass one. It'll change the tempo up kind of thing. But you've got kind of like a little a timer bar at the bottom of the screen as well. So you kind of wanting to make decisions quickly, but also pick the best thing for kind of the situation to make the conversation go in the right direction or to get the outcome you want. But then you also want the song to sound good. So there's quite a few things to consider. It is worth noting, though, that you can turn off that timer option, like that's at the bottom, so that you have a bit more time. Yeah, that's in the settings. And I think that is important that they've included that, because obviously not everybody necessarily mentally or physically is up to making those decisions that quickly. But yeah, it is there. Just kind of to start with. Yeah, that's basically how it works.
Yeah, great. And I'm really heartened to hear that there is the option to disable or tweak that timer, because the first time I heard about that, I thought, oh, this is an accessibility minefield potentially coming up. But no, that's really great. And I'm not surprised, given the talent behind that accessibility is baked into the design like that. I'd love for you to continue with your critique of the game, because I know with your review over at Games Hub that you had a really great time with Stray Gods, and perhaps you didn't quite encounter the same complex dissonance that perhaps James did. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, I guess I can definitely acknowledge what James is talking about there. Like, I totally get that. And I think I come at it from a place of that I'm really into narrative games, and I'm not at all into musicals. So I'm into music, love music, but I don't really like musicals. So I think maybe I have lessened expectations of what a song should sound like in a musical. And because I'm so into narrative games, I was like just happy to pick whatever option felt most authentic to me. And like, definitely there were times where I was like, ooh, the song sounded a bit funny there, but I was just like, oh well, like musicals always sound funny to me. So it doesn't matter. But yeah, in terms of that existentialism, I don't know, any place that I pick up on that, I'm like, ooh, let me see more. Like what kind of like answers or conclusions have they come to about this? And I think it was particularly interesting because Grace is only like 20 something, and like Freddie, her friend, says to her, like, I know you've been at loose ends since you left college. So that's like set up very quickly that she's feeling like that. And the first song in the game is about feeling like that. It's called Adrift. And it's interesting that theme, like, it's not the type of thing where it's like, she's got all these wonderful powers now and everything is going to be fixed, because all of the idols that she meets are arguably like just as lost as she is, but in different ways. So it's kind of like, it doesn't matter if you're a 20-something-year-old or you're 1,000 years old, if you're not kind of acknowledging whatever the issue might be, or you're trying to run from your past, or you're trying to avoid making decisions about the future. If you're not acknowledging that, then you can still just be stuck in that place of like, what the hell do I exist for? Yeah, and I just found that was I like seeing that in games. I always find that interesting.
Anything you'd like to add to that, James, as far as the themes and the story of Stray Gods?
Yeah, I do completely agree. Like, I think the game does such a beautiful sort of holistically human look at, even though they are immortals, right? Like, they do feel like a very, well fleshed out portrayal of, I think, a lot of like very common human problems. I think the stuff that does with memory and the sense of self in particular, and sort of like how we grow and change and how we lose ourselves over time, or how we can find ourselves again. I think that stuff was like absolutely beautiful.
The names don't get much bigger than what we see on the credits of Stray Gods.
Yeah.
What did you think of James? I'll start with you. What did you think of the performances overall?
That it's a wonderful bunch. I mean, like, it is very difficult to go wrong with this particular cast. Laura Bailey's Grace in particular is obviously worthy of all the flowers. Like, she brings so much heart to that performance and that character. I'm terrible with name pronunciation, so I do apologize in advance. But Merle Dandridge as Aphrodite was a major highlight for me as well. And Carrie Payton's Pan, I thought, was also just truly wonderful. I think that, and the way that Grace and Laura Bailey in turn is able to play off a lot of those performances as well was just fantastic.
Yeah, like I guess because I'm not really yet again a big fan of musicals, I really liked the general vocal performances, like the dialogue scenes. But I was also, really surprised and like taken with the vocal song performances as well. And yeah, I would say Grace is like such a strong performance. She really, the voice acting makes that character like as cool as the aesthetics of this game are, that just cherry on top. And yeah, I really liked Pan as well. Not to spoil anything, but yeah, there are romance options with some of the characters, and yes, I liked Pan. He was fun to get to know more.
Yes, I think you and I both liked Pan.
Yeah, I liked Pan. He was fun.
I'd really love to hear what you thought about how well Stray Gods did from a representation standpoint, in particular, like its queer characters and queer themes, because as we've said all throughout this discussion so far, Summerfall Studios, the vocal talent as well, there's a lot of diversity involved. So how well is that representation handled on screen?
I really loved it in Stray Gods. I think that both broadly speaking, and I put this in my review, but like there's like a queer sheen to the game in a way that's really hard to sort of like quantify. But I don't know if it's like sort of the lighting or the kind of sticky sexiness to a lot of the character designs, but like it does feel very much steeped in queer culture. And then you add on top of that the fact that like Grace is the perfect like bi-disaster character. And, even if you don't sort of, I mean, right? She's just wonderful. And the fact that the game lets you sort of without blinking take her in sort of like multiple directions in terms of the outcomes of her sexuality and her romance options. I think it was just like a very nuanced and nice way of handling that. And then you add on top of that as well, just the diversity in the idols themselves and a lot of the issues that brings up, even subtextually, I thought was really fascinating.
And Christy, you seem to react very strongly there to James's comment about the bisexual disaster that is Grace.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. She's a really strong character, and no matter which of the three traits you choose for her, that's always going to come through. So she's just using that strength in slightly different ways. But yeah, like she's still her no matter what. Like I guess like James was saying that he felt more like the kick-ass trait, like I don't know if it was just at times or like in a specific instance, but yeah, like was more him. So I think, yeah, there's like Grace is going to be Grace, and then the trait that you pick is just allowing that little bit of customization or allowing that character to feel just a little bit more like you. Like that's just that little bit that it needs. That I feel like that worked really well.
Yeah, and you touched on as well in terms of the different traits that you can choose and sort of portray throughout decisions and throughout the songs as well. I've heard so much about how no one playthrough is the same and there are so many different choices. So I'm curious, how tangibly different are these choices?
So like there's still kind of the main locations that you need to hit up on each day of the week of your investigation. But in terms of like differences in choices, in the normal dialogue, like if you pick a prompt that's from like a character trait, it'll still kind of circle back around to the point that it wanted to make anyway. I think where you see a really big difference is in picking the song lyrics, like where you want the song to go, because it'll sound different. Grace will say different stuff, obviously. And my understanding is kind of that it's not just like that the song can go three ways. It's that like when you make that first choice, there's a bunch of branches off from there and then a bunch of branches off from there. So actually when you're making one choice, it's then splitting off into like 9 instead of into 3. So yeah, like in terms of that, there's a lot of variation, because depending on if you want to play a song and say just pick the clever options or just pick the charming or just pick the kick-ass, or if you're going to combine them together, that can really come out a bunch of different ways. And I guess as well, like there's some bigger choices in the game, which obviously we can't spoil. And there's also some like romance related stuff that, yeah, you can definitely see very different outcomes. So it's worth playing more than once and kind of playing around with those options.
And with those choices, James, did you feel that perhaps those choices are sort of what played into some of that dissonance that you encountered with the songs and with how they played out? Or did you still find making those different decisions a satisfying gameplay experience?
I mean, I think from a narrative point of view, it's still a relatively satisfying experience. For me, the only reason why sort of it headlines, I think, my experience with the game is because, it is the role-playing musical. Like, it is a pretty major component of this concept. And I think that were this just a straightforward, sort of like visual novel with a couple of branching dialogue options, sure, that's totally fine as well. But for me, it's the way it impacts the sound and the flow of any given moment. I said before that every option does feel like grace. I never sort of like ran into dissonance in that regard. It's just, mechanically where it starts to rub.
Yeah, yeah. And what are your overall thoughts on how the story plays out? Because you mentioned that the story still plays out in a satisfying manner, but were there any particular highlights or any particular things of note that you'd like to mention about the story, James?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I imagine that I won't be alone in this, but I think that there's a stretch in about the middle part-ish of the game. I won't spoil it here, but to do with one of the idols, and there's a party sort of happening, and Grace plays a very pivotal role in this party setting. Is about all we can really say. But like, I've been thinking about that since I finished the game. It really nestled into the back of my brain as, like, to me, what is the crowning achievement of this experience. I think both it has the best song, in my opinion, in the game, and is also just the sort of synthesis of this is like the thesis of their emotional sort of storytelling here. So I really enjoyed that part. And broadly, like, spending time with these characters is pleasant, like that they are a rowdy, lovely little bunch. And so even when I didn't get everything that I needed out of the experience, as a whole, there was definitely a lot of times throughout where I was just happy to be in the company of this world. It's very nicely put together.
I guess my song taste is maybe a bit different than yours. There's a couple of songs like kind of later in the game that I enjoyed more. Like, there's not to say who the character is, but it's kind of more rock inspired. If you know what
I was just thinking, I was like, I'm pretty sure I know the one you're about to say. Yeah.
I had that stuck in my head for many days. And yeah, there's one as well that is a bit more like traditional, but then Grace breaks in with kind of like almost a rap style part that I kind of liked. It was different, but just in general, it's just such an amazing world to be in. Like that, I just love this style of game anyway. So I have no complaints. Like,
so who would you ultimately recommend Stray Gods to?
I think it's an interesting like intersection. I would definitely recommend it for people who like narrative games. I suppose I can't speak for people who like musicals. Maybe James can speak better to that than I can. But I kind of, that was why I kind of wanted to review it, because I thought maybe it would be more likely to be picked up by people who do like musicals. So I was just like, well, what's it going to come across like for someone who isn't into it? And I think also just like Greek mythology is cool. Like, if you're even slightly interested in that, give it a go. It's really cool how they've kind of modernized and reimagined the characters.
I mean, I do think it's very much like a fans of the genre kind of game, in my opinion. I think that if you are into this kind of narrative experience, I think this is going to be, sort of right up your alley. The musical stuff, I mean, it's sort of known in my social circles. My taste in musicals is sporadic at best. I like the strangest of choices. So I'm not really sure how it's going to land. Like I said at the top of the show, like, everyone's ear is very different. And everyone, I think, is going to have a very different experience with this game. I think broadly, though, for what it means for the Australian industry, and I think for all of its ambition, makes it worthy of checking out alone, even if it didn't fully work for me. Like, there are so many good ideas going on in here, and it's such a massive swing for a local studio that, like, I do think it's worth checking out for, anybody who's just interested in our development scene.
Yeah, it's something that is a very exciting concept, even even before actually playing the game, the idea of a role-playing musical is one that's very unique, and perhaps the first time that one of this scale has certainly been attempted. So I'm curious as to whether this will launch a subgenre of its own, and whether perhaps Christy,
I really hope so.
and perhaps Christy, whether we'll see a spin-off, The Witcher musical role-playing game. Would that be something you'd get around?
Yeah, Geralt singing, Yennefer singing. Yeah.
I would
anything
to have
to get
Yennefer
extra.
and Geralt sing to each other.
Yeah.
I would lose my mind.
Oh, wonderful. So ultimately, Christy, with Stray Gods, the role-playing musical, do you drop this game or do you rate it?
Definitely rate it. Yep.
James, how about you?
I'm a soft rate, academically, let's say. Like, I'm not sure I would particularly want to play this again, but I am glad that I did, and I'm glad it exists.
That is Stray Gods, the role-playing musical from Summerfall Studios. We also have a written review up on sifter.com.au from our own Adam Christou, the fabulous reviewer extraordinaire, and there will also be written reviews from both Christy and James for you to check out, which we'll link to as well. And thank you very much to Summerfall Studios and everyone involved for providing pre-release access.
Sit down for a chat with your pals in video games.
You're listening to SIFTER.
This has been Drop Rate by SIFTER, our video game review podcast. Thanks to Brian Fairbanks from Salty Dog Sounds for composing the theme music. SIFTER is produced by Chris Button, Fiona Bartholomeus, Daniel Ang, and Adam Christou. Mitch Lowe is senior producer, and Gianni Di Giovanni is our executive producer. Christy, if people want to see more of your work, where can they find you?
So you can find the stuff that I write on Games Hub. Otherwise, I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads now. There's like a million different versions of Twitter, but that's at Aurelixian if you want to follow me there.
James, how about you? Where can we find you and your work?
Most of the time you can find me over on well-played.com.au. I also frequent on Press Start though as well. That's, the joys of a freelancer. All of the various social networks that we're all scattered across at the moment. OMG more James.
And that's all for this week. You can check out what SIFTER is up to on socials, which is at SIFTERHQ on whatever platform is still running by the time this episode goes out. There's a whole bunch of channels, and you can also jump in Discord and discuss with the team there, which we'll include a link to in the show notes as well. And if you enjoyed this episode of Drop Rate, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform you can review us on, and sharing the episode on social media. This helps put us in front of more people and enables us to provide more in-depth coverage. Plus, you can check out our other podcast, Lightmap, where we talk to game developers, creatives, and people who are doing cool things in interactive media on your favorite podcast app of choice. And if you like to see written games coverage, we also have plenty of that, sifter.com.au, where we have articles, reviews, interviews, and more. Thank you once again for joining us, and see you next time.
Hey there, Gianni here on the latest episode of Lightmap, SIFTER's interview podcast. Abby Howard and Tony Howard-Arias join us to share Slay the Princess, a spooky visual novel that really gets you to question what you're actually doing.
You wake up on a path in the woods, and a mysterious voice in your head tells you that if you do not go to a cabin and slay a princess, she is going to end the world. And what you do with that information from there is entirely up to you.
You poor thing. Your hands are shaking. Are you scared of me? Because you should be.
So one of our challenges has been consistently writing scenarios where there are extremely difficult outcomes, but then there is nothing that can lead to premature player death. So you make a decision, you live with the consequences, you move on.
You can get every episode of Lightmap for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, on sifter.com.au, or wherever you like to listen.